The room in the tower. It's likely that anyone who dreams regularly has experienced at least once a dream event or sequence of circumstances that later manifested in the real world. But in my opinion, far from being strange, it would be far more unusual if this sort of fulfillment didn't happen occasionally, considering that our dreams typically involve people we know and places we're familiar with, which are, after all, the very elements of our waking lives. True, these dreams often get disrupted by some absurd, fantastical incident, rendering them irrelevant to any subsequent fulfillment. But, purely based on the odds, it doesn't seem remotely improbable that a dream imagined by a habitual dreamer would occasionally come true. Not long ago, for instance, I experienced such a dream fulfillment, which to me is unremarkable and doesn't hold any psychical significance. It happened like this. A certain friend of mine, living abroad, is kind enough to write to me about every 2 weeks. So, when 14 days or so have passed since I last heard from him, my mind, either consciously or subconsciously, is anticipating a letter from him. One night last week, I dreamed that as I was heading upstairs to get dressed for dinner, I heard, as I often do, the postman's knock at my front door. In the dream, I changed my direction and went downstairs instead. There, among the other mail, was a letter from him. From there, things took a bizarre turn, for upon opening it, I found inside the ace of diamonds, with a note scribbled across it in his familiar handwriting. "I'm sending you this for safekeeping. As you know, it's risky to keep aces in Italy." The following evening, I was just about to head upstairs to get dressed when I heard the postman's knock, and, just as in my dream, I went downstairs. There, among the other letters, was one from my friend. The only difference was that it didn't contain the ace of diamonds. If it had, I would have given it more thought, but as it stands, it just seems like a perfectly ordinary coincidence. No doubt I consciously or subconsciously expected a letter from him, and that expectation planted the seed of my dream. Similarly, the fact that my friend hadn't written to me in 2 weeks might have prompted him to do so. But sometimes, it's not so easy to find such a straightforward explanation. And for the following story, I can't find any explanation at all. It came out of the shadows, and into the shadows, it has vanished again. My whole life, I've been a habitual dreamer. Few are the nights when I don't wake up in the morning to find that I've had some mental experience, and sometimes, seemingly for the whole night, I'm swept up in a series of dazzling adventures. Almost without exception, these adventures are pleasant, even if they're often trivial. It's an exception that I'm about to tell you about. When I was about 16, a certain dream first visited me. It began with me being dropped off at the door of a large, red brick house where I understood I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was being served in the garden and led me through a low, dark-paneled hallway with a large open fireplace onto a cheerful green lawn surrounded by flower beds. A small group of people were gathered around the tea table, but they were all strangers to me except one, a schoolmate named Jack Stone, clearly the son of the house. He introduced me to his mother and father and a couple of sisters. I remember being rather taken aback to find myself here, since the boy in question was hardly an acquaintance, and I somewhat disliked what little I knew of him. Moreover, he had left school nearly a year prior. The afternoon was very hot, and a heavy, stifling atmosphere hung in the air. On the far side of the lawn ran a red brick wall with an iron gate in its center, beyond which stood a walnut tree. We sat in the shade of the house, facing a row of long windows. Through them, I could see a table set with a tablecloth, gleaming with glassware and silverware. This garden side of the house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-story tower, which looked much older than the rest of the building. After a while, Mrs. Stone, who, like the rest of the company, had sat in absolute silence, said to me, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." For no reason I could comprehend, my heart sank at her words. It felt as if I had known that I would have the room in the tower and that it contained something dreadful and significant. Jack instantly got up, and I understood that I was supposed to follow him. We walked in silence through the hall and up a grand oak staircase with many turns, arriving at a small landing with 2 doors. He pushed one open for me to enter, and without coming in himself, closed it behind me. Then I knew my apprehension had been right. There was something terrible in the room. With the terror of nightmare growing swiftly and enveloping me, I woke up in a fit of fear. Now, that dream, or variations of it, recurred to me intermittently for 15 years. Most often, it played out exactly as I've described. The arrival, the tea laid out on the lawn, the deadly silence broken by that one deadly sentence, the ascent with Jack Stone up to the room in the tower where horror resided. It always concluded with the nightmare of terror at whatever was in the room, although I never saw what it was. At other times, I experienced variations on this same theme. Occasionally, for instance, we would be sitting at dinner in the dining room whose windows I had looked into on the first night the dream of this house visited me. But wherever we were, there was the same silence, the same sense of dreadful oppression and foreboding. And the silence I knew would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Upon which, this was invariable, I had to follow him up the oak staircase with many corners and enter the place I dreaded more and more each time I visited it in sleep. Or, again, I would find myself playing cards, still in silence, in a drawing room lit with immense chandeliers providing a blinding illumination. What the game was, I have no idea. What I remember, with a sense of miserable anticipation, was that soon Mrs. Stone would get up and say to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." This drawing room where we played cards was next to the dining room, and, as I have said, was always brilliantly illuminated, while the rest of the house was full of dusk and shadows. And yet, how often, despite those bouquets of lights, have I not pored over the cards dealt me, scarcely able to see them for some reason. Their designs, too, were strange. There were no red suits, but all were black, and among them there were certain cards that were black all over. I hated and dreaded those. As this dream continued to recur, I became familiar with most of the house. There was a smoking room beyond the drawing room, at the end of a passage with a green baize door. It was always very dark there, and as often as I went there, I passed someone I couldn't see coming out of the doorway. Curious developments also took place in the characters who populated the dream, as might happen to living persons. Mrs. Stone, for instance, who, when I first saw her, had black hair, had become gray, and, instead of rising briskly, as she had done at first when she said, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower," she got up very feebly as if her strength was leaving her limbs. Jack also grew older, becoming a rather ill-looking young man with a brown mustache, while one of the sisters ceased to appear, and I understood that she was married. Then it so happened that I wasn't visited by this dream for 6 months or more, and I began to hope, in the inexplicable dread I held for it, that it had gone away for good. But one night, after this interval, I again found myself being shown out onto the lawn for tea, and Mrs. Stone was not there. The others were all dressed in black. At once I guessed the reason, and my heart leaped at the thought that perhaps this time I wouldn't have to sleep in the room in the tower. And although we usually all sat in silence, on this occasion the sense of relief made me talk and laugh as I had never done before. But even then, Things weren't entirely comfortable, for no one else spoke, but they all looked secretly at each other. And soon, the foolish stream of my conversation ran dry, and gradually an apprehension worse than anything I had previously known took hold of me as the light slowly faded. Suddenly, a voice I knew well broke the stillness. The voice of Mrs. Stone, saying, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." It seemed to come from near the gate in the red brick wall that bordered the lawn, and looking up, I saw that the grass outside was sown thick with gravestones. A curious grayish light shone from them, and I could read the lettering on the grave nearest me, and it was, "In evil memory of Julia Stone." And, as usual, Jack got up, and I followed him through the hall and up the staircase with many corners. On this occasion, it was darker than usual, and when I passed into the room in the tower, I could only just make out the furniture, whose position was already familiar to me. Also, there was a dreadful odor of decay in the room, and I woke up screaming. The dream, with such variations and developments as I've mentioned, continued at intervals for 15 years. Sometimes, I would dream it 2 or 3 nights in a row. Once, as I said, there was a 6-month break. But taking a reasonable average, I'd say that I dreamed it at least once a month. It had, as is obvious, something of nightmare about it, since it always ended in the same appalling terror, which, far from diminishing, seemed to gather fresh fear each time I experienced it. There was, too, a strange and dreadful consistency about it. The characters in it, as I mentioned, got regularly older. Death and marriage visited this silent family, and I never, in the dream, after Mrs. Stone had died, set eyes on her again. But it was always her voice that told me that the room in the tower was prepared for me, and whether we had tea out on the lawn, or the scene was laid in one of the rooms overlooking it, I could always see her gravestone standing just outside the iron gate. It was the same, too, with the married daughter. Usually she was not present, but once or twice she returned again, in company with a man whom I took to be her husband. He, too, like the rest of them, was always silent. But, owing to the constant repetition of the dream, I had ceased to attach any significance to it in my waking hours. I never met Jack Stone again during all those years, nor did I ever see a house that resembled this dark house of my dream. And then something happened. I had been in London for most of the year, up until the end of July, and during the first week in August, I went to stay with a friend in a house he had rented for the summer months in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. I left London early, as John Clinton was, to meet me at Forest Row Station, and we were going to spend the day golfing, returning to his house in the evening. He had his car with him, and we set off around 5 o'clock in the afternoon after a thoroughly delightful day for the drive, a distance of about 10 miles. As it was still so early, we didn't have tea at the clubhouse, but waited until we got home. As we drove, the weather, which had been deliciously fresh, although hot, seemed to change in quality and become very stagnant and oppressive. I felt that indefinable sense of ominous apprehension that I'm accustomed to feeling before a thunderstorm. John, however, didn't share my feelings. Attributing my lack of cheer to the fact that I had lost both my golf matches. Events proved, however, that I was right, though I don't think the thunderstorm that broke that night was the sole cause of my unease. Our way lay through deep lanes bordered by high banks, and before we had traveled very far, I fell asleep. I was only awakened by the car stopping. With a sudden thrill, partly of fear but chiefly of curiosity, I found myself standing in the doorway of my dream house. We went, I half wondering whether or not I was still dreaming, through a low, oak-paneled hallway and out onto the lawn, where tea was laid out in the shade of the house. It was set amidst flower beds, with a red brick wall containing a gate Bordering one side and beyond that, a patch of rough grass with a walnut tree. The facade of the house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-story tower, markedly older than the rest of the building. Here, for the moment, all resemblance to the recurring dream ceased. There was no silent and somehow terrible family, but a large assembly of exceedingly cheerful people, all of whom were known to me. And despite the horror the dream itself had always filled me with, I felt nothing of it now that the scene of it was reproduced before me. But I felt the intensest curiosity as to what was going to happen. Tea continued its cheerful course, and before long, Mrs. Clinton got up. And at that moment, I think I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me, and what she said was, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." At that, for half a second, the horror of the dream took hold of me again. But it quickly passed, and again I felt nothing more than the most intense curiosity. It wasn't very long before it was amply satisfied. John turned to me. "Right up at the top of the house," he said, "but I think you'll be comfortable. We're absolutely full up. Would you like to go and see it now? By Jove, I believe that you are right, and that we are going to have a thunderstorm. How dark it has become." I got up and followed him. We passed through the hall and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door, and I went in. And at that moment, sheer unreasoning terror again possessed me. I did not know for certain what I feared. I simply feared. Then, like a sudden recollection when one remembers a name which has long escaped the memory, I knew what I feared. I feared Mrs. Stone, whose grave with the sinister inscription, "In evil memory," I had so often seen in my dream, just beyond the lawn that lay below my window. And then, once more, the fear passed so completely that I wondered what there was to fear. And I found myself, sober and quiet and sane, in the room in the tower, the name of which I had so often heard in my dream, and the scene of which was so familiar. I looked around it with a certain sense of proprietorship, and found that nothing had been changed from the dreaming nights in which I knew it so well. Just to the left of the door was the bed, lengthways along the wall, with the head of it in the angle. In a line with it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Opposite the door, the outer wall was pierced by 2 lattice-paned windows, between which stood the dressing table, while ranged along the 4th wall was the washing stand and a big cupboard. My luggage had already been unpacked, for the furniture of dressing and undressing lay orderly on the washstand and toilet table, while my dinner clothes were spread out on the coverlet of the bed. And then, with a sudden start of unexplained dismay, I saw that there were 2 rather conspicuous objects which I had not seen before in my dreams. One, a life-sized oil painting of Mrs. Stone, the other a black and white sketch of Jack Stone, representing him as he had appeared to me only a week before in the last of the series of these repeated dreams, a rather secret and evil-looking man of about 30. His picture hung between the windows, looking straight across the room to the other portrait, which hung at the side of the bed. At that, I looked next, and as I looked, I felt once more the horror of nightmare seize me. It represented Mrs. Stone, as I had seen her last in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired. But in spite of the evident feebleness of her body, a dreadful exuberance and vitality shone through the envelope of flesh, an exuberance wholly malign, a vitality that foamed and frothed with unimaginable evil. Evil beamed from the narrow, leering eyes. It laughed in the demon-like mouth. The whole face was instinct with some secret and appalling mirth. The hands, clasped together on her knee, seemed shaking with suppressed and nameless glee. Then I saw also that it was signed in the left-hand bottom corner, and wondering who the artist could be, I looked more closely, and read the inscription, "Julia Stone by Julia Stone." There came a tap at the door and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," said I, pointing to the picture. He laughed. "Hard-featured old lady," he said. "By herself, too, I remember. Anyhow, she can't have flattered herself much." "But don't you see?" said I. "It's scarcely a human face at all. It's the face of some witch, of some devil." He looked at it more closely. "Yes, it isn't very pleasant," he said. "Scarcely a bedside manner, eh? Yes, I can imagine getting the nightmare if I went to sleep with that close by my bed. I'll have it taken down if you like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant, we detached the picture and carried it out onto the landing, and put it with its face to the wall. "By Jove, the old lady is a weight," said John, mopping his forehead. "I wonder if she had something on her mind." The extraordinary weight of the picture had struck me too. I was about to reply when I caught sight of my own hand. There was blood on it, in considerable quantities, covering the whole palm. "I've cut myself somehow," said I. John gave a little startled exclamation. "Why, I have too," he said. Simultaneously, the footman took out his handkerchief and wiped his hand with it. I saw that there was blood also on his handkerchief. John and I went back into the tower room and washed the blood off, but neither on his hand nor on mine was there the slightest trace of a scratch or cut. It seemed to me that, having ascertained this, we both, by a sort of tacit consent, did not allude to it again. Something in my case had dimly occurred to me that I did not wish to think about. It was but a conjecture, but I fancied that I knew the same thing had occurred to him. The heat and oppression of the air, for the storm we had expected was still undischarged, increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom were John Clinton and myself, sat outside on the path bounding the lawn where we had had tea. The night was absolutely dark, and no twinkle of star or moon ray could penetrate the pall of cloud that overset the sky. By degrees our assembly thinned. The women went up to bed, men dispersed to the smoking or billiard room, and by 11 o'clock my host and I were the only two left. All the evening I thought that he had something on his mind, and as soon as we were alone, he spoke. "The man who helped us with the picture had blood on his hand too, did you notice?" he said. "I asked him just now if he had cut himself, and he said he supposed he had, but that he could find no mark of it. Now, where did that blood come from?" By dint of telling myself that I was not going to think about it, I had succeeded in not doing so, and I did not want, especially just at bedtime, to be reminded of it. "I don't know," said I, "and I don't really care, so long as the picture of Mrs. Julia Stone is not by my bed." He got up. "But it's odd," he said. "Ah, now you'll see another odd thing." A dog of his, an Irish terrier by breed, had come out of the house as we talked. The door behind us into the hall was open, and a bright oblong of light shone across the lawn to the iron gate, which led on to the rough grass outside, where the walnut tree stood. I saw that the dog had all his hackles up, bristling with rage and fright. His lips were curled back from his teeth, as if he was ready to spring at something, and he was growling to himself. He took not the slightest notice of his master or me, but stiffly and tensely walked across the grass to the iron gate. There he stood for a moment, looking through the bars and still growling. Then, of a sudden, his courage seemed to desert him. He gave one long howl and scuttled back to the house with a curious crouching sort of movement. "He does that half a dozen times a day," said John. "He sees something which he both hates and fears." I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something was moving on the grass outside, and soon a sound which I could not instantly identify came to my ears. Then I remembered what it was. It was the purring of a cat. I lit a match and saw the purrer, a big blue Persian, walking round and round in a little circle just outside the gate, stepping high and ecstatically, with tail carried aloft like a banner. Its eyes were bright and shining, and every now and then it put its head down and sniffed at the grass. I laughed. "The end of that mystery, I am afraid," I said. "Here's a large cat having Walpurgis night all alone." "Yes, that's Darius," said John. "He spends half the day and all night there. But that's not the end of the dog mystery, for Toby and he are the best of friends, but the beginning of the cat mystery. What's the cat doing there, and why is Darius pleased, while Toby is terror-stricken?" At that moment, I remembered the rather horrible detail of my dreams when I saw through the gate, just where the cat was now, the white tombstone with the sinister inscription. But before I could answer, the rain began, as suddenly and heavily as if a tap had been turned on, and simultaneously the big cat squeezed through the bars of the gate and came leaping across the lawn to the house for shelter. Then it sat in the doorway, looking out eagerly into the dark. It spat and struck at John with its paw as he pushed it in order to close the door. Somehow, with the portrait of Julia Stone in the passage outside, the room in the tower had absolutely no alarm for me, and as I went to bed, feeling very sleepy and heavy, I had nothing more than interest for the curious incident about our bleeding hands and the conduct of the cat and dog. The last thing I looked at before I put out my light was the square empty space by my bed, where the portrait had been. Here the paper was of its original full tint of dark red. Over the rest of the walls it had faded. Then I blew out my candle and instantly fell asleep. My awaking was equally instantaneous, and I sat bolt upright in bed under the impression that some bright light had been flashed in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room which I had dreaded in dreams, but no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after a peal of thunder crackled just above the house, but the probability that it was only a flash of lightning which awoke me gave no reassurance to my galloping heart. Something I knew was in the room with me, and instinctively I put out my right hand, which was nearest the wall, to keep it away. And my hand touched the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter onto the floor. But for the moment there was no need of light, for a blinding flash leaped out of the clouds and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. And instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also, namely a figure that leaned over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mold, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder cracked and roared, and when it ceased, and the deathly stillness succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming nearer me, and, more horrible yet, perceived an odor of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close beside my ear I heard quick-taken, eager breathing. Yet I knew that this thing, though it could be perceived by touch, by smell, by eye, and by ear, was still not of this earth, but something that had passed out of the body and had power to make itself manifest. Then a voice, already familiar to me, spoke. "I knew you would come to the room in the tower," it said. "I have been long waiting for you. At last you have come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together." And the quick breathing came closer to me. I could feel it on my neck. At that, the terror, which I think had paralyzed me for the moment, gave way to the wild instinct of self-preservation. I hit wildly with both arms, kicking out at the same moment, and heard a little animal squeal, and something soft dropped with a thud beside me. I took a couple of steps forward, nearly tripping up over whatever it was that lay there, and, by the merest good luck, found the handle of the door. In another second, I ran out on the landing, and had banged the door behind me. Almost at the same moment, I heard a door open somewhere below, and John Clinton, candle in hand, came running upstairs. "What is it?" he said. "I sleep just below you, and heard a noise as if— Good heavens, there's blood on your shoulder." I stood there, so he told me afterwards, swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with the mark on my shoulder as if a hand covered with blood had been laid there. "It's in there," I said, pointing. "She, you know. The portrait is in there too, hanging up on the place we took it from." At that he laughed. "My dear fellow, this is mere nightmare," he said. He pushed by me and opened the door, I standing there simply inert with terror, unable to stop him, unable to move. "Phew! What an awful smell," he said. Then there was silence. He had passed out of my sight behind the open door. Next moment he came out again, as white as myself, and instantly shut it. "Yes, the portrait's there," he said, "and on the floor is a thing spotted with earth, like what they bury people in. Come away, quick, come away." How I got downstairs, I hardly know. An awful shuddering and nausea of the spirit, rather than of the flesh, had seized me, and more than once he had to place my feet upon the steps, while every now and then he cast glances of terror and apprehension up the stairs. But in time we came to his dressing room on the floor below, and there I told him what I have here described. The sequel can be made short. Indeed, some of my readers have perhaps already guessed what it was, if they remember that inexplicable affair of the churchyard at West Fawley some 8 years ago, where an attempt was made 3 times to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide. On each occasion, the coffin was found in the course of a few days, again protruding from the ground. After the 3rd attempt, in order that the thing should not be talked about, the body was buried elsewhere in unconsecrated ground. Where it was buried was just outside the iron gate of the garden, belonging to the house where this woman had lived. She had committed suicide in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone. Subsequently, the body was again secretly dug up, and the coffin was found to be full of blood. The end. If you liked the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.